From the WATE.com Digital Center, answering your legal questions. This is Ask Isaacs. Now, here's Lori Tucker and attorney Greg Isaacs.
And hello, everyone. Bo Williams in for Lori Tucker, joined by Greg Isaacs. Greg, great to have you here.
Good to be here, Bo.
We're going to talk today about the ongoing situation, the developments out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, following the shooting and the killing of Renee Good, a 37-year-old woman. By now, most of you have seen the video. The tensions continue to escalate there in Minneapolis from both sides right now. This doesn't seem to be at any point going to calm down at any point right now. Both sides still very adamant, whether the shooting was justified or not.
Legally, politically, emotionally, Bo, there are no signs that this tempest in Minnesota is going to calm down. And it just seems to it's one of those unfortunate situations where you have a killing. And I'm using the word killing because, we don't know that it's a homicide. Mm-hmm. We don't know really until all this shakes out. You have pundits, you have people on behalf of the Homeland Security giving their take, their spin. You've got mayors, you've got governors interjecting their beliefs. But until the Department of Justice looks at this or law enforcement, it is just that. But it's unfortunately one of those things that has captured the nation, and I think that debate is going to keep going for quite some time.
Well, and one of the more recent developments just this week, at one point it was 4, I saw in the New York Times, they're saying 6 now, but federal prosecutors resigned over the Justice Department's push to investigate the widow of the woman killed by an ICE agent. If you remember, her partner got out of her wife got out of the car, was questioning ICE agents. But 6 federal prosecutors in Minnesota have now resigned. Also, they're also objecting to the approach for the Justice Department's refusal to include state officials in investigating whether the shooting itself was lawful. So some strong opinions by some of the federal prosecutors in Minnesota, but a lot of them have now stepped down.
Right. And everybody we think has seen the video, but let's just put it into a factual context. Good and her spouse, her wife, were on the scene in an ICE operation, and one of the ICE vehicles became disabled in the snow. And it appears from media reports and from viewing the videos that protesters engaged the disabled vehicle to try to block its ingress-egress. Other officers arrived. They were told to cease and desist, get out of the vehicle. And the wife had gotten out and was starting to film. And what Good does, it's depicted by the videos, is place the vehicle in reverse, then engage it and start to go forward. And here's where the debate begins. And an ICE officer fired 3 shots using lethal force. And the videos depict that when the officer discharged the firearm, he was to the side of the vehicle versus the front of the vehicle, which is contrary to federal DHS policies. And after that lethal shooting, it has been an explosion on both sides. Individuals trying to justify this lethal use of force, and individuals calling for a prosecution.
And a lot of people out there asking too, what is the law? Now, is this like state by state? I mean, I don't know what as far as here in Tennessee, as far as what rights a law enforcement agent would have in a situation like that, as far as opening fire.
Well, let's just use, first of all, there is federal jurisprudence, federal rules, regulations, and statutes that govern the use of lethal force by the Department of Homeland Security. And it's interesting, under the DHS guidelines, it is prohibited to use deadly force just to disable a moving vehicle. That's DHS policy statement 044-05. So basically, under federal law, shooting at a moving vehicle is prohibited. The only exceptions are if someone is threatening inside the vehicle, deadly force by means, this is important,
Okay.
by means other than the vehicle. Because
Okay.
the vehicle under Tennessee law can be a deadly weapon, but there's got to be a use of deadly force by means other than the vehicle itself under the DHS policies. And secondly, the vehicle must be operated in a way that poses an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. And this is important. And no other objectively reasonable defenses appear available, including, and Bo, I'm going to read this very slowly, including stepping out of the path of the vehicle. So when you read, as we read the word together, as they say Sunday mornings, the DHS policy statements, which should articulate the standard of care for a federal ICE officer, it would appear that there is a prohibition about using deadly force, discharging a firearm just to disable a moving vehicle. And further, they have a duty to try to get it out of harm's way. Also, when you look at this through the lens of the federal government, recent Supreme Court jurisprudence has weighed in as recently as 2025. The U.S. Supreme Court said in Barnes versus Felix, they change the test. So let's, when you look at this, if I was a prosecutor or a defense lawyer, I would go frame by frame by frame by frame. And the issue or the test under the Felix framework, it requires a totality of the circumstances test on whether you were in threat of serious bodily injury or death. The Supreme Court in Barnes rejected the narrow moment of threat. So you get into this, and you hear prosecutors, you hear defense lawyers, we argue all the time, fight or flight, fight or flight. We both use it to mean your adrenaline's pumping, time contracts, space explodes, your perception can't be trusted as you're faced with a threat. But the Supreme Court said not so fast.
Okay.
It's an objective standard, so we're not looking through the eyes of the officer that pulled the trigger. We're looking at the totality of the circumstances and objectively whether that use of force would have been justified. Also in Barnes, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of rejected the very narrow moment of threat test. So, in those videos, when you see the officer to the side of the vehicle, whatever, under the Supreme Court's holding in Barnes Felix, you've got to look at all the totality of the circumstances that brought us to the discharge and use of lethal force. So that's what the analysis is going to be. And there are two parallel trains. This officers could be prosecuted federally. I think that's highly unlikely based on the statements by DHS officials. But also under state law, and let's kind of use Tennessee law as a backdrop. Under Tennessee law, a law enforcement officer is entitled to use deadly force if they think a suspect has committed a felony involving serious bodily injury, death, or sex abuse, or that the officer is in immediate or imminent threat of serious bodily injury, or others would be. Now, under Tennessee law, the law encourages the officers to give a warning when feasible. Federal policy, on the other hand, calls for someone to de-escalate, calls for the officers to de-escalate the situation, which Tennessee does not. Tennessee has a reasonable person test. So the difference is Tennessee requires exhaustion of reasonable alternatives. Federal law requires basically a duty to de-escalate, and also really gives a blanket prohibition against firing into vehicles unless there is an imminent threat of serious bodily injuries or death.
And what's interesting when you bring that up, too, I saw reports today that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent who shot Good they're now saying suffered internal bleeding injuries to his torso. So now he's like, wait a minute, okay, so now he's suffered some type of injury. Does that come into play? Saying, well, okay, well, maybe did he think?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Again, under Barnes versus Felix, the U.S. Supreme Court has articulated this very expansive test that calls for a totality of the circumstances and an objective standard. So I think all of that is going to factor in.
And there have been some reports too. Some people have said, well, maybe you were talking about whether or not you can actually open fire on a moving vehicle, but there were 3 shots fired.
Yeah, and the videos depict the officer kind of positioned at a 45-degree angle or beside the vehicle. And think about it this way: the law does not allow you to step in front of a vehicle and create the deadly force and then use lethal force, the lethal threat. So, it's a very tough question, but let's look at if the Supreme Court was looking at this case under a totality of the circumstances test. One, why was Renee Good and her spouse there at the scene? And from reports, it appears, and first of all, regarding which side of the courtroom you're on, there is nothing good or positive about using lethal force, being under a threat that compels you to use lethal force. From a humanitarian perspective, it's not good. It's not good that the officer had to do it. It's not good that if that was the analysis, Renee Good lost her life. But at the same point, under a totality of the circumstances, the first question I think one would ask, why was she there, and what precipitated the interaction with ICE? And it would appear that she and her spouse were there to disrupt an ICE operation. Now, I will tell you, if you see a law enforcement operation, or you see a law enforcement situation where someone's stopping a vehicle, whatever, and you attempt to interfere in that investigation, you will be told in no uncertain terms to cease, desist, to stop. You could be charged with obstruction of justice, a lot of things. So the first thing that stands out to me, why was Good and her spouse there in the middle of this ICE operation? And that really didn't have anything to do with the proprietary of whether the ICE should be there, shouldn't be there.
Right.
Whether,
well, I guess it goes to the law of just where is the law when it comes to a legal protest. What can you and can you not do?
Well, we all under the First Amendment have the right to peacefully assemble and to address our grievances against the government. Absolute right. With there are 27 shades of gray. You obviously can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. You can't send your neighbor child pornography. But the First Amendment is a fairly blanket protection. Now, on the other hand, you do not have the right to interfere, even if you disagree, with a law enforcement investigation, with a law enforcement operation, just because you think it's immoral, violates immigration policies, et cetera. So there's a difference between a peaceful protest on one end of the spectrum and on the other end of the spectrum, obstruction of justice. So first prong, totality of the circumstances, why were they there? Second, were they given a command by law enforcement, regardless of whether that command was good, bad, ugly, justified, not justified? And when we look at this and we break it down, yes, they were told to get out of the vehicle, whatever, and obviously they didn't. So as you see, when you analyze the situation, those are two things that the officer is processing, courts, prosecutors will process. But then it comes to the moment, Bo, of utilizing lethal force.
Right.
And, that's another level of inquiry.
Yeah, and again, we kind of want to go back to what happened on Tuesday when you had the federal prosecutors resigning over the Justice Department's push to investigate the widow of the woman killed. and the department's reluctance to investigate the shooter. So that is another reason why these prosecutors now have said, you know, apparently they're not happy with what the Department of Justice is doing. They feel that the shooter should be investigated just as much as the situation and was this even warranted. So a lot of different questions there, which obviously has raised a lot of questions there in Minnesota, where you have some of their top prosecutors now stepping aside, disagreeing with how this is being handled, I guess.
Well, how this normally works, one, whether you in a retaliatory manner investigate the wife, obviously that would not be appropriate. And we don't know why the Justice Department would be investigating her. We really don't know why they were there.
Right. There's still a lot of questions leading up to be answered.
Yeah, under the totality of the circumstances. But, you know, the way when you have these cases, whether it's George Floyd, all of these, typically there is a separation between a federal Department of Justice investigation and a state investigation. When I see everyone calling foul because we can't participate in your investigation or whatever, that's not the way it typically is under separate sovereigns. You have the federal government, different standard, different laws, different constitution. You have a state, which has an individual constitution, separate laws, separate duties when it comes to law enforcement and lethal force. So it seems like the complaints that these two separate sovereigns aren't in lockstep is atypical to me. Now, you know, the other thing is that you see in a case like this is a homicide that was captured, as we see unfortunately all too often, on cameras, on video footage. And it was a week ago yesterday when the shooting of Renee Good took place. To be protesting and crying and screaming because no one's been charged, et cetera, whatever, that's not the way this happens.
Okay.
Typically somebody is placed on administrative leave, and we say there's an ongoing investigation. Now let's use Tennessee as a model.
Yeah, let's bring it back here to the volunteers.
Anytime there is a policeman involved or law enforcement involved shooting, the protocol by the local attorney general is to step back. So if you're in that county, you're that mayor, you step back. And in Tennessee, we let the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation conduct an independent, objective investigation. Okay. And it typically takes time. You look at the forensics, you look at the autopsy, you sit there and you get directional rods, and you try to look at the ballistics and the trajectory of where a round was fired.
So this can take weeks, months, even
years
in some cases.
So to complain that nothing's happened, I conversely would, if I was someone, complain if something did happen, because it would be a significant rush to judgment. But, you know, when you look at the big picture from Google Earth, the use of lethal force nationally has fallen significantly. It's the lowest that it's ever been since 2015. In Tennessee, there was, in 2024, in terms of use of force reports, including deadly force, it has gone down 44%. So think about that. That is a dramatic drop in the last decade in Tennessee. There was 315 people that were the victims of lethal force. So, you know, when I look at the numbers, they're not overwhelming, they're not staggering, but, you know, one could easily argue that one use of lethal force, if it's unjustified, is far too many. But, you know, Bo, I guess back to the beginning, you know, whether you're John Q. Public, whether you're a prosecutor in the state office of the Minnesota Bureau of Investigation, or whatever acronym they have, whether you're in the Department of Justice, whether you work for the New York Times, you know, you have to, under current law, look at this under a totality of the circumstances and what an objective person would do.
Yeah. And now, even expanding out of this, we're seeing obviously the state of Minnesota had meetings with the Twin City representatives last night, but there's still discussions of that lawsuit that the state of Minnesota bring against the federal government as far as the surge of ICE there as well. So while we have this case, there are even other cases that are being spawned, which really were kind of coming about even before the shooting occurred. But it just seems like it is now even getting more momentum and more attention right now, as we're seeing different cases now start to pop up concerning, ICE, the shooting, the state of Minnesota, the rights. A lot of questions. There's going to be a lot that's going to come out of this that I'm assuming other states are keeping a close watch on to see how all of this plays out.
Well, what you find when you have a lethal use of force and it captures the attention of the nation, whether it be George Floyd, whether it becomes Renee Good, it expands beyond, it becomes larger than the lethal use of force investigation itself. And that's what you see. This case is not about whether ICE should have been there, should not have been there. It's not about whether it's a justifiable policy on enforcement of immigration. What this case is about, whether it was an ICE agent, whether it was a DEA agent, whether it was an FBI agent, did they follow federal law? Did they follow their standard of care? And I was actually, and Bo, let's go back and touch on again, let's just say Bo and Greg are running the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
But under the
current
administration,
what should people be watching for here? I mean, what do we really need to be? People sitting at home following this case as it plays out.
You know what I would do if I were you and I was sitting there?
Yeah, I mean, you already said one.
I would look at two things. Look at the policy statement, and that's the rules of the game. 044-05 of the Department of Homeland Security, and it says everything. I mean, it says, do not shoot at a moving vehicle. Try not to shoot at a moving vehicle. Do not stand in front of a moving vehicle. Use other avenues before you use lethal force. Actually, it's a much higher standard than the Barnes-Felix test of the Supreme Court. So, that to me would be a problem in analyzing this.
Yeah.
And you got to look at everything frame by frame, objectively, under the totality of the circumstances, not that narrow moment of, okay, the car's moving, fight or flight, I've got to react. But, unfortunately, when you have an analysis of a lethal use of force, you also have to look at how the situation took place, and sympathy, empathy, politics, etc. But it appears that Renee Good and her spouse put herself in the middle of whether it's an ICE, DEA, FBI operation, and there was some attempt apparently to obstruct that operation, and there was commands by law enforcement that were disregarded, that were not listened to. So, anytime there's a loss of life, it's a heavy thing to deal with legally. But at the same point, this case is one that illustrates the tough questions that have to be asked, and they shouldn't be political questions. They should be questions that there are answers to. You should have some degree of objectivity,
right?
Because that's kind of hard now in the way things are whatever. Is the Department of Justice going to be objective as it relates to their investigation of DHS, or are they going to be an advocate for DHS? I mean, in theory, they're not supposed to be the Department of Homeland Security's attorneys. So let's see how this plays out. I would say take a deep breath, take politics out, look at the law. But this case,
that's the key. Look at the law. What does the law say?
It says to look at the totality of the circumstances, and that tells me, why was she there? What was her behavior? What was her intent? What's the standard of care for the law enforcement officers? But the problem is, and it begins and ends with this, the optic of the car going straight with the officer apparently out of harm's way, shooting not once, not twice, but 3 times. I think if that happened in Tennessee, it would violate the lethal use of force policies. So it remains to be seen. But It's a legal inquiry. It's an unfortunate legal inquiry, but not a political inquiry.
Yeah, all right. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this again down the road. Thanks so much for watching. As always, Greg joins us every week. You can also catch Greg with us at 5:30 on WATE each Wednesday as well. Greg, as always, thanks.
Thank you, Bo.
Yep.